Well, hello, and thank you for joining me for another Alex on Tech and iTWire TV video interview. I'm joined today by Andrew Philp. He's the field CISO at TrendAI Australia and New Zealand, the new name for Trend Micro, which we've known about for nearly 4 decades. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and thank you, Alex, so much for having me.
Well, Andrew, thank you for taking the time. Now, we're going to go into much more detail in a moment, but could you please briefly recap TrendAI's mission and the value that you bring to customers in 2026?
Yeah, thank you. So TrendAI is the enterprise business unit for Trend Micro. So I guess it's important to note that Trend Micro as a group and a legal entity still exists, but our mission is to really wrap ourselves around our enterprise customers. We have thousands of them across Australia and New Zealand region, and really be able to make sure that we can help them embrace AI in a fearless way. Our tagline is AI fearlessly, not recklessly. So our mission is to really be able to sit with our customers and do that. And we do that through our AI-powered platform called Trend AI Vision One.
Now, for the thousands of enterprise customers that you support across Australia and New Zealand, government, critical infrastructure, financial services, etc., what changes are there on the ground? And are they getting a new capability with Vision 1, or is this a signal that the entire engagement model is shifting?
It's a great question, Alex, and something that certainly people are really interested in hearing about. The exciting news is that we're a new identity. So we're all about innovating quicker and meeting customers where they need to be. But actually, the people that our customers are used to working with, that partnership, the long-standing relationships, that remains the same. The fact that we have already for decades been innovating with AI, and that is in the platforms that our customers are using, stays the same. And what they really get is the way that we sort of talked about it is we're treating ourselves like a startup, but we're a startup that has, 500,000 global business customers already, which is a great starting point.
Now, IBM's data shows 13% of organizations reported breaches involving AI models or applications last year. I mean, quite an amazing thing. It shows how much people are using AI. But 97% of those lacked proper access controls. Now, your own Securing the AI-Powered Enterprise report found 68% of Australian respondents say AI is advancing faster than they can secure it, while 44% of senior business decision makers report only moderate understanding of the legal frameworks governing AI. That's a pretty stark gap between AI adoption speed and security readiness. So from what you're seeing with ANZ enterprises, is the gap narrowing, or are organizations still adding AI onto environments that aren't ready for it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I love that you referenced that data. Getting data in Australia and New Zealand specifically is really difficult. So we've got a cohort of data out of Australia, which is really relevant. And it is a very interesting gap difference. And I think, though, that we'd expect to see that. And I think the reason that we expect to see that is that, as we were talking about before, we've both been in technology for a very long time, and we've never really seen before anything that's come into technology that's had the amount of FOMO that AI has. So when I say FOMO, that's fear of missing out. We're seeing, everything from the board level right through to, every user of an organization just having this desire to get AI and not really necessarily understanding the outcomes that they even want to achieve. So it's unsurprising that people are, I guess, finding themselves really wanting to push forward with that innovation without necessarily being ready. What I would say, though, is I don't believe that that gap is necessarily narrowing, because it's still a very rapidly changing area. And as much as you will improve in some areas, it'll change in others to force more change. But I think that this is one of those things that we're never going to be 100% ready. We've had a few of the public cloud was a good example from sort of the last decade. We've had a few of these things that, security teams and organizations have wanted to be ready, but it hasn't necessarily played out very well because it hasn't meant that they've been able to embrace that technology. So I think actually it's more about understanding the visibility of what's going on, being able to translate that into a business risk, and then actually being able to embrace it nevertheless around that without feeling like we have to be 100% ready before we say yes and turn the floodgates on.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the interesting things about this is that this is a problem for now, but in 5 years, when all this is much more bedded down, it'll just be all be taken for granted, and we'll have newer and better challenges to solve.
Yeah, it's interesting. Depends on who you listen to as to what 5 years will look like from an AI world. But you're quite right. And you know what doesn't change is the way that we look at business. So when we look at business and we look at business risk, the really interesting. So I actually did my company directors course last year through the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And when we start to look at business, actually, boards are about compliance, they're about meeting obligations and legal requirements. But their primary, function is to govern an enterprise. And to govern an enterprise is to make that enterprise profitable. It's to make sure that it achieves the outcomes that it has. So I think what won't change is the need for organizations to be, to perform, to meet their missional goals and to manage risk. So if we actually start to look at AI as a different risk, but still a risk inside of cyber, and be able to compare that to other areas, then those things will evolve over 5 years, but we'll be able to then evolve the way that we approach that and make the right decisions that we need to make.
Now, Andrew, you more or less answered part of my next question, but I'll ask it anyway because you may have more to say. But your research found that 66% of Australian business decision makers have felt pressure to approve AI initiatives that pose potential security or compliance risks. I mean, you were just talking about risk there. Now, only 26% have had formal mandatory AI training. Now, combined with IBM's finding that shadow AI adds $670,000 per breach on average, that's a recipe for trouble. In Australia, where data sovereignty and privacy obligations under the Privacy Act are already complex, how are CISOs you work with tackling this? Is it a problem that with technology? Is it a policy problem? Or, as I suspect, both? Again, noting that you already answered part of that, but what else do you have to say?
Yeah, and I'd agree that it's probably a both problem, and I think to expand a little bit on what I sort of said before. So, I mean, privacy issues are one of those big issues that people are facing. So we saw recently that OAIC has finally sort of launched its civil penalties against a large telco that got breached, and the way that they're interpreting fines is actually a per record that was gone. So the amount of the fine is just horrendous. Like, of course, they're never going to be able to issue such a big fine. It would, it's more than the GDP of Australia, but it kind of gives you an idea of where the caps are looking. So that represents a large risk for some businesses that have those large PII spaces. So I think that ultimately what it comes down to doing is how are we looking at that risk? I spoke about the risk and reward, from a governance perspective. That kind of drives us to actually look at where are we prepared to take risk. So if we're using a technology like cloud, for example, or if we're using a technology, an outsourcer that might have access to that data, we have to make the right decision on whether the risk is worth the reward of doing that approach, giving that PII to that provider or using that cloud service. The same thing's true when it comes to AI. If the consequence of this is this high, do we actually have the tolerance for that? Do we have the appetite to say we might get a fine like this if this is misused? So we will ultimately, what I see is that we'll kind of end up into different gears of innovation. So we actually have to be able to look at that risk and say, right, we don't have the appetite to take that risk with privacy. But perhaps if we're wanting to do a growth initiative over here and we can sandbox that and make sure that there's not, particular data around there, we can actually take a much higher, appetite for risk there because that's going to have a reward on it, but it's not going to have the consequences that affect that. So I think really, yes, it is complex, but ultimately it's driving back to saying, what is the underlying risk? What's the reward that we're likely to get from that innovation? And can we kind of absorb taking that risk? And I think it's looking at that balance that really helps us to overcome those complexities. And what I see the big gap there is we need to give those tools to the CISO. The CISO needs to have that information in front of them real time. They can't wait for a quarterly report or for a third party to come in and show it to them. They've got to be able to see, actually, this is what the impact to this business is right now. This is what the risk is worth from a dollar value. And this is how I'm going to use that to advise.
Now, just to go a little bit deeper in a slightly different direction, but again with risk management, Australia's SOCI Act is already pushing risk management obligations deep into critical infrastructure organisations. Now you can add AI governance on top of that. The Australian government's AI guidance for OT environments, ISO 42001 for AI management systems. Your own data shows more than 40% of Australian organisations cite unclear regulation and lack of internal policy as key barriers to safe AI adoption. So how are you helping ANZ customers, beyond what you just explained, navigate this pile-up of compliance requirements without it becoming an exercise in ticking boxes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. And if we were to read through some of those advices and the ISO standards, it would take a very long time to get through all of that. I mean, ultimately, what we find though, if we sort of take a little bit of a step back out. I mean, SOCI obviously applies to a certain, category of organisation here in Australia. It's a very thorough risk management plan with, cyber just being part of that. If we sort of start to take a look at what are the guidelines around AI, and I think really a lot of them still sort of stand back to that, to a certain extent, a little bit of common sense around assessing what you're using the AI for. How are you going to measure its output? What are you going to understand in that space? And how are you going to control along that space? So ultimately, it kind of comes back to being able to give visibility in each of those areas, really. And I think that when we can start to unravel and actually show what is being used in the organization, what is it accessing and how is it accessing, it kind of has that technological answer that the organization needs. So it gives the technical controls to align up with some of those frameworks that we've seen. And I think to come back to the other point, because you make a good point about the unclearness about regulation, because ultimately we still don't have regulation. I mean, the EU has AI regulation. We've got some guidelines in this different space. So it's not surprising that people are a little bit confused around that because there aren't particular laws that have to happen. And my advice to people in that space is to go back to the laws that we do have. I mean, we have plenty of laws around privacy protection and other different things. And if you follow those principles with the guidelines that have been given to, use those principles well when it comes to AI, it's not a regulation, but it'll at least get you closer to understanding what it means for you.
TrendAI has staked its strategy on Vision One as a single pane of glass for cyber risk. Gartner, IDC, and Forrester have all recognised it, but security teams have heard the unified platform pitch before. What's different about Vision One's approach to governing the AI lifecycle, from infrastructure to models to users, compared to competitors making similar claims?
Yeah, a great question, and thanks for that candid question as well. I think that the answer there is yes. There has been a lot of speak about consolidation. Every year if you go to a Gartner conference, they'll say people are trying to drive towards consolidation for lots of reasons, but people still on average use about 40 or 45 security tools in the enterprise, which is crazy. I think what's truly driving that change is the rate of what is changing from a threat perspective. So, attackers using AI more autonomously because they don't have that cost of failure. The fact that we have to be able to adopt innovation quicker, and the fact that we've got a lot of budgetary pressures, like, a lot of cyber spenders going towards AI. So really that's renewing the need for a platform. And when we talk about what truly differentiates our platform, I think the first thing, and you talked about it being a big bet, and I think that's a great way of putting it, but it's a big bet that's followed lots of other successful big bets. So when the industry was talking about EDR, endpoint detection and response, we were building our XDR, cross-layer detection and response, and we were using that depth of technology that we had to do that. When the industry was sort of catching up about trying to bring things together, we were looking at how we do risk management and we report that back to people. So actually this unified platform bet is just a continuation of that, to say actually we've done so much evolution. We've been using AI in this platform for 2 decades. It's really just about continuation of that and making sure that everyone has access in one spot. And what we actually see is the proof points in that. And the proof points is when we start to inject AI and help customers with their security using AI in that platform, we saw our enterprise customers across ANZ that were using our risk management solutions, they actually dropped their overall risk score by 25% in 2025. So we see that this approach works and we know that it reduces that effort. So yeah, we're really, really confident on our big bet there.
Sounds like it was something worth betting on. Should have bought shares.
That's right.
Now, TrendAI has grounded its AI security strategy in 4 core principles: visibility into AI usage, understanding context and intent, enforcing policy, and maintaining human oversight at critical decision points. So important for that. Your research shows less than half of Australian business decision makers, 42%, believe a human should always remain in the loop for AI-driven security operations. Can you walk through a real scenario, anonymized of course, where those four principles played out in an ANZ customer environment? What did it look like from detection through to response?
Yeah, so this is a very common scenario actually. So, the anonymized example would be one for, dozens of customers that we've seen across the way. That first step is always to really understand what actually exists in the environment. So that visibility is really important. We do that in a couple of different ways. So most customers will start with looking at the data that they already have. So, sensors on endpoints, different integrations that we have. They can start to understand the applications that the users are accessing. The next step is we can actually turn on gateways, and then that starts to give the context. So now we can start to understand what are the applications that are being used, what are they being used for, and what data are they putting into that and taking out of that. And that kind of leads into the perspective where we can actually start to govern or put policy around that. So that policy could be a decision of, let's switch these ones off. We don't trust these providers. And it could be a thing of, well, we do trust these providers, but we want to limit. So we know privacy is a big risk. We want to limit the data that goes into that. And that kind of enables humans really to have that part of that decision in that space. So that's played out countless times. And it's just a way of being able to have people gradually go through. But what we want is that the cyber team then advises. We don't want the cyber team to start just turning things off, because we know that users have personal devices and they'll figure out a way to do it anyway. So we want to be able to advise. The second area where those four principles come in, which is probably a little bit more interesting, is when we start to go to autonomous agents. So, we've seen a lot of this going on with OpenClaw. OpenClaw's gotten really, really popular in this space. And that's where the human in the loop becomes even more important. So the same rules apply. Using the platform, we can understand where those instances occur. So we know if something's been installed on that laptop to be able to do that. It's a bit of a scary one because it only has to use those user credentials. But an example of this rapid innovation through the new identity of TrendAI, we played with this internally. I got the privilege of actually being in the chats with the different OpenClaw bots, which was really, really interesting. And then at the end of that, we realized that something has to change. So we built a gateway, basically an agent gateway. So instead of the agents communicating directly with the user identities, they communicate through the gateway. And then that gives the granular ability for the teams to be able to say anything that's a read-only type of request, let it do it autonomously. But if it's going to do it right, if it's going to send out a calendar invite or an email or make a change to something, then that needs to have approval. So it's a perfect way of being able to bring the human into the loop in a really succinct way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. I mean, we've got at RSA, every security company was talking about using agentic AI. It was something that is becoming standard. And once again, within 5 years, we'll take all this for granted. But at the moment, it's still new, it's exciting, it's different. You've got to take all these different things into account. And, this leads into TrendAI having announced a collaboration with Hackerverse for adversarial testing using autonomous AI agents. It's all pretty new. Don't know how much you can explain about it. But last year, your Sydney-based R&D team ran an AI hackathon in partnership with AWS focused on building AI-powered solutions to real-world cybersecurity challenges using Vision One. That's a striking shift from traditional pen testing. And your research shows that 45% of Australian respondents see AI agents accessing sensitive data as their biggest risk, with 34% concerned about autonomous code deployment. So what does Trend AI learn from those adversarial AI engagements, and how is that shaping the way you advise ANZ enterprises to stress test their own AI deployments?
Yeah, great. And there's actually kind of, a lot of different topics as part of that one question. So
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
just
sorry about that, but
break them down and sort of answer some of them. So let's start with the hackathon. And the hackathon is, we've been doing this for a long time. And this is a great opportunity to just take off all of and lots of organizations do this successfully, take off all of the barriers and just say, hey, if you had an open canvas, how can you use AI to be able to really improve this flow? So that builds into those tools. The example of the agent gateway that I spoke about was effectively a real-time hackathon going on. We've played with OpenClaw, we've seen that this is the case. Let's spin up a proof of concept and show that we can do this in a good way. So that continual innovation drives the products, which then ultimately drive how people can, use this more successfully. When we talk about the Hackaverse collaboration that we're speaking about, that's a slightly different angle. So if we look at what Hackaverse does, they actually spin up arenas. So our security tools are deployed in the arena, and then they use a lot of autonomous agents to attack those tools using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then actually give a real-time score on how those tools are performing. So in a way, it's actually sort of taking the burden for customers and evaluating the efficacy of those tools and being able to do that in a very independent way using common techniques like MITRE. So that's a really exciting proof point that we can actually then offer to customers. But that notion is still true on your original question, which is what does it mean to move to sort of real-time testing as opposed to looking at once in a point in time penetration test. So we have a really big strategy around that for 2026. It'll be coming later this year, which is digital twin. So if you think about the amount of data that we collect, that we understand in an environment, what would typically happen, like you say, is you would employ a firm to come and do penetration testing, and they would come and do a point in time test and see whether they could break through all of that. It typically takes time, money, disruption, and it is point in time. So imagine a digital twin world where actually we have a synthetic copy of that environment and that we can actually automate continual attacks in that. And then the results of that, the shortfalls, the things that need to be improved, just get implemented into the production environment, but without causing any damage, without waiting for that point in time. So digital twin is going to be a really big evolution, which stops this point in time penetration testing.
That's amazing. I've heard a lot about digital twins with companies like SAP and Celonis who do process intelligence, process mining. So it's great to see this approach being used in the security field. I mean, it's kind of one of those things that's obvious once you sort of think about it. Why did nobody ever think about it before? But we didn't have the tools before to really synthesize that whole environment in such a precise way. So kudos to being the first company I've heard about in security who's talking about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it is a very exciting area. And you talk about the tools. So for us, the world has exploded with AI, but it's been really helpful for us as well. So we do a thing called cyber risk quantification. So we look at the actual financial impact to a business. I mean, to do those simulations, tens of thousands of simulations was, impossible to do before. With AI, it's trivial now. Similarly with digital twins, it's not quite trivial, but, being able to have that power actually unlocks that. But the other thing that's been the key for that is breadth. So, we've spent decades building up the breadth of our platform. If you don't have all of that data, then your digital twin is not going to be a true replication of what that environment looks like. So, yeah, a lot of work's going into that, and we're really excited about that for the second half of this year.
Great, yeah. Now, Andrew, as a field CISO who advises boards and executive teams on cyber governance and risk management frameworks, you're in these conversations every week. So what does the shift look like in practice? Are boards asking their CISOs fundamentally different questions now compared to 12 months ago? And are CISOs equipped to answer them, or is there a skills gap opening up between AI literacy and security leadership?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, they are asking different questions, and no, CISOs aren't necessarily ready to respond. But to expand on that a little bit, the AICD had a governance forum in Sydney a few weeks ago. The message there was to aggressively embrace AI. So again, message from the top, aggressively embrace AI. And I think the questions are changing from the board. Where we used to have a question sort of 12, 18 months ago, how secure are we? How likely are we to get breached? And that was sort of the flavor of the month with all of the media attention that we're getting. The question now comes down more along where can we take risk? How quickly can we adopt this new technology? And how can we make sure that we do that safely? And that's a very different question. It's a question I think we've wanted from a cyber perspective for a long time. We've wanted to be advisors in that space. We don't want to be just treated as the insurance policy. But to do that, we need to have that real-time information. So, I briefly spoke about how we're using AI to drive cyber risk quantification. And I think actually seeing where their entire environment sits, aligned to business risk and financial value at any given time to enable those conversations, which at the moment are coming up all of the time from board and executive. I don't believe CISOs, for the most part, have access to that easily right now.
Now, you just were talking about 12 to 18 months in the past, but looking 12 to 18 months in the future, what does success look like for TrendAI in Australia and New Zealand? Are there specific verticals such as government, healthcare, financial services, energy, etc., where you expect the biggest shift in how organizations approach AI security? And what's the one thing you'd want every enterprise CISO reading iTWire and watching this video interview to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, so I think just to break that down a little bit, as far as the industries, I mean, we do believe that AI, unlike some previous technologies, will be pervasive across all industries, but we still see that there's particular industries that will be quicker to adopt. Financial services have a lot more capital and people to put behind that. Government tends to take a little bit longer to implement some of these things due to the business process. And then we do see areas like energy as being a little bit more risk adverse. So inside of 12 to 18 months, it will transform, most industries. They'll just have a different speed and risk tolerance towards that. What would success look like for us in the next 12 to 18 months? We really want to continue expanding on the success that we've had with that platform. We want to keep seeing that the overall risk for our organizations is, one, understood and communicated well to the business, and two, continues to come down and be within the bounds of what the organization needs it to be. Because we believe that if that happens, people can then embrace new innovation at the speed that the organization should be doing it. Not necessarily wants to be doing it, but the speed that the organization should be doing it. And I think, yeah, that one sort of piece of advice to CISOs that are listening to this is, we definitely don't want to be seen as blockers in this space. We want the message to be, as security teams, we can let our organizations embrace AI fearlessly, not recklessly, but fearlessly. And if we do that in the right way and look at it from a risk perspective, then we'll be able to drive that success.
Andrew, without giving me your final message yet, as I'll ask you about that at the end, is there anything else about TrendAI that we need to know that we haven't already discussed before we move on to a couple of my usual personal closing questions?
Thank you. So yes, I think that, we've covered a lot of sort of the ground that we've worked in this space, but I think really the one part that I feel personally proud of as part of my journey is just the way that the quantifying risk and managing risk and aligning that to businesses, the impact that it's had on the people side. So we often talk about technology. We spend our whole time speaking about all of these different changes that happen. But behind that, there's teams of people. There's CISOs, there's security operations teams, there's people that are doing the work. What I've actually seen is, we have a really short turnover. So it's hard to get real hard data, but anecdotal data sort of says, CISOs last about 18 months and, security operations people can last about 12 to 18 months. And it's because there is no way that what they can do can ever be everything. There's no such thing as being 100% ready or perfect. And when we've seen actually the organization adopt a way of looking at a risk profile and agreeing that, we actually see those same teams that were overworked and could never keep up with things, knowing that if they keep within this area, that's what the business accepts, and the business accepts that region. And actually that change in people's, mentality is really important for us. And we have a team, a big team in Australia and New Zealand. We've got R&D people here. We've got people in each of the countries. We've been here for over 25 years. They work really closely with these companies. So I think from a personal perspective, that's just something that we see as great success.
Now, Andrew, you just mentioned something about CISOs, lasting 12 to 18 months before they leave. And one of the reasons why I've seen that security staff leave is because of the mental stress of when a breach or an attack occurs. And then you can have, like with one of those phone companies you spoke of before, I mean, it was a third-party tool, it was a third-party system that somehow let hackers in laterally. And, the actual systems itself from memory were secure, but some third-party accident allowed people to get in. And next thing, you've got government ministers calling for your head. And, if you're called at 3 a.m. as you're part of the security team, it's not the boss ringing to say what a great job you've done. It's because somebody's attacking the system and you need to get in there right now to help stop the problem. And so this whole issue of the mental health of the stressed out cyber defender needing its own defending by companies is what I saw with a company called Cyberminds with a Z.org, set up by Peter Coronius, who founded the Internet Industry Association of Australia many years ago, and is now moving into this space to make sure that companies are actually helping their staff stay, not get PTSD, have mental wellness, and also to ensure that the older staff are able to coach and help the younger staff, so that the younger staff who could be fresh out of university don't feel like they're cannon fodder and like, why didn't anybody prepare me for this? So I'm just wondering, how does TrendAI help not only its own staff but those of the cyber defenders of the companies you work with to deal with this? And is this an opportunity for me to connect you with Peter Coronius so that you guys can talk about how to implement this in your own systems?
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, obviously, always happy to talk to people in the industry. I think it's the problem that you pointed out is one that's close to my heart, as I just explained. And I think that ultimately, there's a couple of observations, and then I'll sort of talk about what we're doing about it. One of the key things, we've included a lot of our key customers in events and things that we've done to share knowledge with others. So they'll share from the trenches incident response stories. And the mental health aspect, when it's shared well, always comes up. And that's because actually, when you're doing 20-hour days to try to recover from a circumstance, the last thing that's often thought about is healthiness in people, and then what to do when that expands. So actually, when we practice incident response, normally it's in a very easy way. It's a table. We're doing a tabletop simulation. It lasts for 2 to 4 hours, and we all go back to our normal day jobs and go home and into our families at night. Actually incorporating the mental health aspect when we do those incident simulations, and what are we going to do? Who are we going to talk to? Who are we going to be supported by? I think is really, really important, and that's something that I've heard countless times from our customers saying, actually, what we're doing to improve this is to make sure that we practice how to look after people and how to prioritize people in the midst of these situations, when everything's turning to crap around you. So I think that's a really important aspect. From our side of things, what I genuinely believe, and it'll sound a little bit like a broken record, but it's a lot about actually agreeing the risk appetite with the organization, agreeing what you're funded to do and what you have the time to do, and then making sure the organization knows that when things fit outside of that, they have to accept that risk. Because often, as you say, CISOs are the scapegoat. They need to sign up this risk. They don't actually own the risk. It's always going to be the business advisors that own that risk. But ultimately, we want to make sure that we have a much better way of communicating that. So if we can be really clear, Gartner talks about a thing called PLAs, or protection level agreements. They just talk about it in the aspect of, if you can patch within 14 days, and that's what you're resourced for and you're funded for. If something happens on day 16, it's a failure, but if something happens on day 13, it's not. We try to expand that out to right across their scenario. So that CISO, as part of their preparation for protecting their mental health, agrees with the organization what can be funded, what they have the resource for, what can be done within a reasonable amount of time, and the risk that leaves. So therefore, if something does happen, they can't be attacked afterwards, and the board and the executive can take that understanding. So I think taking those steps means that actually that mental health aspect becomes a lot better, because they're not carrying this burden of, I can't do this. It's a shared burden, which is how risk should be managed.
Yeah, absolutely. And even Google, just today as we're recording, has announced the new mental wellness and health initiative. In fact, yesterday I was using Gemini to create infographics for an article that I was writing, as I'll be doing for this article, and the article that accompanies this video. And I forgot to actually paste in the article that I wanted the infographic created of. I just said, please create an infographic. And so I went off and did one, and it was all about mental health. So Gemini knew something that Google hadn't yet announced. I mean, it was quite funny to see that. But it just underscores how important this is. I mean, it's not just about the health of your computing systems, it's about the health of your staff that are operating tolerating them that is super important. And, you've always got the issue as well of internal sabotage because somebody's being bribed and all the rest. And, these are all super important issues companies have to take care of. And it's great to see that this is really happening in 2026 onwards.
Absolutely. And I think like I say, we can get carried away with thinking that AI is going to take over all of the knowledge working. There's an evolution. And again, interestingly, when I was at the Gartner conference, they were talking about what does cyber look like in 10 years' time from an AI perspective. Their expectations and their hype curves are a little bit more conservative than some of the messages that you get out there. So, we need people. We're always going to need people. We're a human society. And so, as you say, looking after people first and foremost is actually our responsibility, not just an add-on effect afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we get to my third last question, which is to ask if you could please share a memory of your first personal computer and afterwards the first personal computer that you bought for your children.
We're going way back in time now. So my first personal computer, I think I got it off my grandparents. I was about 10 or 11. It was a green screen processor. So you put a 5¼ inch floppy disk in, and you could just type documents. And I think I had a dot matrix printer of some sort that I could print it out. That was the absolute limit of that. The first computer that I bought for my kids. It would have been through their school, I think. Probably would have been a Chromebook or something like that. So it just shows how much things had changed in that generational change. They were required to have that. It was just a basic, lasted forever laptop. Very different to what I grew up with when I was a kid.
Yeah, kids today don't understand how basic it was. I mean, even tapes, even typing things out of computer magazines to make games work is a far cry from the 3D environments and 120 frame rates per second. All the rest we take for granted today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, could you please also share some of the best advice that you've received in life to help you get where you are today?
I think that the best advice that I've always had is really just to do everything you can to the best of your ability. And I know that sounds pretty cliche, but we live in a world where our attention spans are quite small. And I think, I grew up straight out of school into a small IT company as my best friend's dad ran it. You learnt the hard way that you have to do everything the best that you can to be able to, compete in that space, to be able to move through that. And I think the value that you then have, the tasks that you're doing and what you learn to do in that space, I've been able to apply that to virtually everything that I've done since then.
Yeah, and in the 21st century, in 2026, AI is there not to help you cut corners, but to make sure that what you're doing really is right.
Absolutely. I mean, I use AI significantly from a research perspective and to try and get my thoughts aligned. I still need to check AI because there's obviously a lot that needs to help in that space. But I think that, ultimately it should be a tool. I mean, the thing that we need to be always cognizant of is these tools can actually end up making us way more busy and having less attention span because we can do more in that day. So definitely, carving out times where you're actually just thinking and using your human brain is very important in the day.
Yeah, I like to call it organic intelligence. I saw that on X somewhere, and it's like AI and OI.
Yeah, love it. Organic intelligence.
Yeah. So, Andrew, what is your final message to the viewers, listeners, and readers?
Yeah, my final message is that, there might be a lot of FOMO going on. There might be a lot of pressure to do different things. But actually, if we go to some of the basics, if we use the advancements that we've got from AI to do those basics better, we can actually go in with some real confidence. And truly now, I've been doing this for, over 3 decades, we can really start to be the value enhancer as cybersecurity teams rather than the insurance. And that's just so exciting.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew Philp, Field CISO at TrendAI, Australia and New Zealand, thank you for taking the time. I look forward to the next time that we speak, and I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye.